Hello and welcome to The Voluntarist. In past videos, over the last couple of years, I've made attempts to kind of revise the non-aggression principle, try and make it more robust, able to stand on its own 2 feet a little bit better. So, continuing with that tradition, we'll be discussing an article today that was written in 2013 by Matt Zwolinski for libertarianism.org. And maybe your first question is, why are we reviewing an article that was written so long ago? Well, libertarianism.org likes to tweet out articles from their website, and apparently they don't really care how old they are. But nonetheless, the title of the article is 6 Reasons Libertarians Should Reject the Non-Aggression Principle. So naturally, me being who I am and being interested in this kind of thing, I clicked on it. And so now I've been thinking about it for a couple of days, and I just would like to get a few thoughts off my chest and maybe refer you back to an older video that I made. The quality is terrible. I was reading off of a script really slowly, and there's really irritating jazz music playing in the background, and I apologize for that. But I think it's definitely worth a watch. At least for what I was trying to do there. And I'll mention that a little bit later in this video. He says, this principle, the non-aggression principle or non-aggression axiom, hereafter NAP, holds that aggression against the person or property of others is always wrong, where aggression is defined narrowly in terms of the use or threat of physical violence. So here I just wanted to point out that he totally misses the part about the initiation of physical violence or the threat of physical violence. But I would say that generally he's correct. And even though he doesn't state it explicitly here, it seems to be that he has implied the initiation of force throughout the discussion. So it's not really that big of a point, but I think it's a kind of a sloppy definition to ignore the initiation. That's a huge part of the NAP, is the initiation of force and violence is wrong. So, anyways, jumping right into the 6 reasons, and we'll take these one by one. He makes some good points sometimes, and I think some other projects that I've worked on in terms of strengthening the NAP could benefit from these arguments, and I think they are things that people need to be conscious of. Of course, I have a really good theory that I would like to contribute to the discussion at the end of this. Some original thinking that kind of borrows some stuff from podcasts that have been going on recently. I'm going to spoil the whole episode before we get there. Just keep listening. That's what I'm trying to say. Keep listening. Bear with me. Okay. So reason number 1. The NAP prohibits all pollution. I'll just read what he says. As I noted in my last post, Rothbard himself recognized that industrial pollution violates the NAP and must therefore be prohibited. But Rothbard did not draw the full implications of this principle. Of his principle. Not just industrial pollution, but personal pollution produced by driving, burning wood in one's fireplace, smoking, etc., runs afoul of the NAP. The NAP implies that all of these activities must be prohibited, no matter how beneficial they may be in other respects, and no matter how essential they are to daily life in the modern industrialized world. And this is deeply implausible. And I would say, yes, indeed, it is deeply implausible. But with regard to this, I think it is important to give the NAP some power to address this point, whether it's a revision to the actual principle itself, or in how we understand it upon closer examination. One such little snippet of understanding I think we should have when discussing the NAP is that it's very important to show that an action has caused an obstruction of property. The NAP essentially describes actions which violate property rights. The reason people tend to focus so much on the initiation of violence or the threat of violence is because these things most directly are used to impose your will, or for the aggressor to impose their will on a victim and manipulate their use of their own property, or sometimes obstruct it completely, take their property. And this is true for the actions of murder, theft, rape, assault, and I would even argue fraud, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So it's important that when we're discussing the NAP that we keep in mind that you have to be able to show that an action has obstructed your use of property. So in terms of pollution, you can say that carbon dioxide is bad for you, and everyone driving their car is producing carbon dioxide, and then you're breathing that in, and that's bad for you. But you have to be able to show that this is actually obstructing. This is actually obstructing your use of property. This is actually harming you in some way. And then once you're able to show that, if you are at all, then you can go about asking, how should reparations be paid to you for the harm that's been caused. But in a lot of cases, like the carbon dioxide from cars, there's really not a substantial amount, not a noticeable amount of like health damage to your health that occurs as a result of that. And furthermore, it can also be argued that these are necessary byproducts of the technology and automation, the technology of modern society that makes the current population possible, right? Before automation, before machinery, before a lot of, like cars, factories, whatever, we didn't have the means to support the current population. There was a population explosion around the time that markets started to liberalize, and people gained the freedom to have free trade. And then once slavery was banned, people started actually investing in automation because it then became economically incentivized to do so. And then all this investment into automation, rather than just relying on slave labor, led to massive advances in innovation and technology, which further supported growing population. So all of these things are byproducts of things that we desperately need to survive. So that's definitely worth taking into account. And that's certainly something that should remain in the conversation as we move forward. But I would argue, at least for now, that we can kind of hand wave the question of small pollution away, because you have to be able to show that something is actually obstructing your use of property, obstructing your use of your body, or of something else. Now, in the case of like ridiculous pollution, like a factory somewhere dumps a bunch of toxic sludge out into a pond, and then it kills all the fish, and then all the surrounding property owners find weird carcinogens laced into their lawn and in their water supply, then you say, okay, this is definitely going to hurt me if I drink this water, and it's your fault. And you're going to come and pay to have all this cleaned up, clean my water, get this stuff out of my grass, pay for my dog's funeral because he was eating the grass the other day. Stuff like that. You have to be able to show that it was harmful. So there are cases where pollution can be directly linked to an obstruction of property rights, but then there are other cases where it really can't. It's just too small. It's not significant enough, as the exhaust from cars, for example. Unless you're in the camp that exhaust from cars is almost exclusively causing global warming, which is going to kill everybody, then that's a conversation for another day. And I think perhaps, yeah, no, I'm not going to mess with that one in this video. That's a whole nother thing. But these are all good things to keep in mind. So I'm just going to move on to the next point. Prohibits small harms for large benefits. So this is kind of continuing that the NAP prohibits anything that could possibly be conceived as harmful. Um, and I'll go ahead and read so that I'm not attacking a straw man on accident. So here we go. The NAP prohibits all pollution because its prohibition on aggression is absolute. I think the consideration that I just gave kind of has altered that a little bit, but no amount of aggression, no matter how small, is morally permissible, and no amount of offsetting benefits can change this fact. But suppose, to borrow a thought from Hume, that I could prevent the destruction of the whole world by lightly scratching your finger. Okay, that's a bit ridiculous. And even the next one is a little ridiculous. Or to take perhaps a more plausible example, suppose that by imposing a very small tax on billionaires, I could provide life-saving vaccination for tens of thousands of desperately poor children. That's a joke. All right, so he's saying, well, taxation should be okay if we can help a lot of people with the tax money. It's like, no, well, taxation is theft, because in order to extract that wealth from people, you have to threaten them with physical violence and imprisonment. So no, that's an example of a clear and blatant moral wrong that is not permissible, because that you can actually show that taxation actually does harm people, because you're taking their wealth from them, not by voluntary association, not because they want to give it to you, but because you're threatening them with locking them in a cage for several years if they don't cooperate. And again, so I could provide life-saving vaccination for tens of thousands of desperately poor children. I doubt that a very small tax on billionaires would provide for that. Regardless, even if it could, if this taxation program, if the benefits were so amazing and so wonderful, why wouldn't people pay for it themselves? I mean, you can see that the United States, especially, one of the freest countries in the world, also the most charitable country in the world. So if you could make the case that, oh, look at all these poor, starving children, I mean, you start talking about sick and dying children, the wallets come open. This has been proven time and time again. That's why there are so many charities for children, is because people are really willing to donate to those kinds of causes, because it matters. Children still have their whole lives ahead of them. If you can save one, that's a huge return to society, and it makes a lot of sense, economically speaking, anyways. And then you've got people who just want to help people, which is another great reason to contribute to charity. But yeah, if something is so great, people will pay for it voluntarily. To force someone to pay for something is just an admission that it's not that great. Because let's say I'm going to produce a record, or an album, and I've got all this music on it of me, my lovely singing voice, and I think it's great, and I think everyone would benefit from listening to my music. So I go to the state and I say, hey, I need you to charge everyone a very small tax, so that I can produce my albums and get them out to everybody, and then pass a law that makes everyone listen to it, because I think it really do everyone a world of good. Or my YouTube channel, pass a law that says everyone has to listen to one of my videos every day, because I think they're really important, and they are really important, but I would never force anyone to listen to them. So this is kind of an example of the absurdity of this argument. If my singing voice was actually so great, people would just go buy my albums, right? I wouldn't need to force people to buy them if it was that great. And if my YouTube videos were more entertaining, people would watch them. But it's just me talking about philosophy. But bless you for watching this. All right, so I think I've beaten that one to death. So prohibits small harms for large benefits. This kind of goes back to what I was saying with the first point. You have to be able to show that an action has actually caused an obstruction of property, caused a non-consensual obstruction of property. And in that respect, whether it's small or large, if you can show that it's harmed you, then I believe it can be argued that you've been wronged by someone and that you're owed owed reparations. So, yeah. Moving on. Beating that one to death. All or nothing attitude toward risk. So this is an interesting point. I'll read what he says again. The NAP clearly implies that it's wrong for me to shoot you in the head. But to borrow an example from David Friedman, what if I merely run the risk of shooting you by putting one bullet in a 6-shot revolver, spinning the cylinder, aiming at your head, and squeezing the trigger? A little crazy. What if it is not 1 but 5 bullets? Of course, almost everything we do imposes some risk of harm on innocent persons. We run this risk when we drive on the highway. Okay, all right, that's enough of that. Okay, so there's a big difference between driving on a highway and putting a bullet into the cylinder of a revolver, spinning it around randomly, and then pointing it at someone and pulling the trigger. And I feel like this is fairly obvious to anyone with half a brain, but I guess he's just saying that there is some risk involved, therefore they're relatable. And I guess there is a spectrum of risk, but there's also the purposes of the risk. Right, so if you put a bullet into a revolver and you spin it, and there's a 1 in 6 chance that when you pull that trigger, the person you're aiming the gun at is going to die. The question is, why are you doing that? What the hell do you think you're doing pointing a loaded gun at someone and then pulling the trigger? And then you compare this to getting in a car where there are set rules. You drive between the lines. You stay in your lane. You go a speed limit set by whoever owns the road as the safe speed limit. And there are all these rules that you and everyone else on the road are expected to follow, because that's the way to keep everyone safe and also make sure that everyone gets to where they need to go on time. So people are on the road for a reason. First off, they're trying to get somewhere. And while they're on the road, they're doing everything within their power, as much as, your average human being is capable of keeping everyone around them safe. They generally drive the speed limit. They generally stay in their lane. I think most people tend to use their turn signal when they change lanes. But there are a lot of things that people do to keep themselves and others safe. When I just don't even see how that's comparable to putting a bullet into a 6-shooter and playing Russian roulette with someone's face. I just that comparison is a little beyond me. And this all or nothing attitude toward risk, I don't think the NAP even addresses risk. Like I said, it's a threat of violence or the initiation of violence. And I think if you're pointing a loaded gun at someone and you pull the trigger, like pointing a loaded gun at someone, whether or not you pull the trigger, that's a threat of violence. You're threatening them because I mean, I don't even know how this could be argued otherwise, but if you point a loaded gun at someone, that is a tool used to kill things or blow holes in things, depending on what you're using it for. But in that instance, it's a tool used to kill that person. And if you decide to pull the trigger, they're gonna die, or there's a really good chance they're gonna die. So I mean, the primary use of a car is not to plow through crowds of people unless you're a terrorist, right? In that case, you being anywhere near a car is kind of a threat to people, right? But again, you can't really know people's intentions. But that's getting a little off subject. So I think what needs to be taken into consideration here is the action being performed, the purpose of committing that action, and the kind of societal expectations around people using certain objects like a gun or a car, and how those are different. Because there's something inherently different between the action of pulling the trigger of a loaded gun while pointing it at someone's face, or getting in a car to drive to work. Very, very different. And as far as the NAP goes, I just refer back to what I've been saying the whole time. You have to be able to show that that an action is obstructing your use of property. And if someone's pointing a gun at you and you think you're about to die, don't you think that would severely impact your decisions in the next few moments? I mean, you lose all free will that you have in that moment because you are on survival instincts at that point. It's totally different. it's totally different. All right, so I beat that one to death again. Moving on to number 4. There's no prohibition of fraud. And this is actually a good point. This is one of his better points. Libertarians usually say that violence may legitimately be used to prevent either force or fraud, but according to the NAP, the only legitimate use of force is to prevent or punish the initiatory use of physical violence by others. And fraud is not physical violence. If I tell you that the painting you want to buy is a genuine Renoir, I'm not familiar with paintings at all, so I might be butchering that guy's name, but and it's not. I have physically aggressed against you. I'm sorry, I have not physically aggressed against you. But if you buy it, find out it's fake, and then send the police or your protective agency over to my house to get your money back, then you are aggressing against me. So not only does a prohibition on fraud not follow from the NAP, it is not even compatible with it, since the use of force to prohibit fraud itself constitutes the initiation of physical violence. Okay, so this comes into the interpretation of the usefulness of the NAP. What is it actually used for? And I believe the NAP is used to indicate only those actions which are wrong, but it's also used as a way of defining property rights in a way. It's like, what are you allowed to do with your property? What are other people not allowed to do with your property? And it's kind of this absolute theory of property, meaning that if you don't consent to your property being used by someone, or if you don't consent to someone touching you or taking your stuff, or whatever it is, whatever property it is, painting your house without your permission, it all comes back to this idea of property rights, which is essentially one of the primary functions of the NAP, is to strengthen property rights from the perspective of ethics. But one of the main ways you know that your property rights have been violated is if your property is used without your consent. So I think the idea of consent in property rights can be focused on, especially here under the scope of fraud and how it relates back to the non-aggression principle. In another video that I did about 2 years ago, when I first started this kind of revision of the non-aggression principle, I created this thing called the moral theory of obligatory inaction, which is essentially, it expands on the non-aggression principle, and it kind of explicitly, the whole purpose is to just describe what is morally wrong to do accurately, and try to describe certain actions that must never ever be done under any circumstances. So here you can see that I've got these three criterion. An action is morally wrong if, first, it initiates violence or the threat of violence upon a non-consensual person or their property. So that's essentially the non-aggression principle in a nutshell. In fact, the first criterion is pretty much the non-aggression principle. I would call that the non-aggression principle. And then the second criterion is that it causes or enables a non-consensual exchange of value. And maybe my wording here was a little sloppy. It was 2 years ago, so I'm just now revisiting it for the purposes of discussing this article. The intention of this second criterion was solely to address fraud and kind of swindling people out of their property by presenting them with utter nonsense or lies, or like a bait and switch situation to get things out of them that they would have not given you if you had been honest with them. And there are some problems here too. Like, what if I give someone the information that I have at my disposal, but it turns out not to be accurate, and they come back and sue me because of the exchange, right? Well, that's something to be addressed, of course. And I would argue that as long as you're giving information that's up to date, as accurate as you can, then you're not really at fault. Because I mean, you're doing the best you can. It's not like you were trying to swindle someone out of their property. But then it comes into the idea of what was your intent? Why did you say the things that you did? Did you actually believe that the information was up to date and true? And that's a topic for another video. But that's a huge area of discussion. When you start trying to read people's minds, when you start trying to understand the motivations behind an action, the law becomes not enforceable. Of course, luckily, we're not really talking about the law here. We're just talking about morality. But it does help a lot if a moral code can be enforced. Unfortunately, a lot of morality does have to do with the intentions of the person committing the action, because we can only really judge if an action is right or wrong. We can't judge the thoughts of a person. Like if you're thinking something, I can't say, those thoughts are bad, those thoughts are good, those thoughts are permissible, right? Because whether or not you're thinking something that is morally reprehensible or shocking, they haven't translated into action yet. So, I mean, they may later, for sure, but thinking is not a crime. But the thoughts that inform an action, the thoughts that cause you to, or the thoughts that you use as justification for an action, or your reasoning, I think those do inform the moral value of the action. Because if you're going to kick a puppy, right? If you're maybe the puppy was on fire and you were trying to kick the puppy into a pool of water, then you would say that even though you kicked the puppy, you were doing it for a good reason. You're trying to help. Or if you kicked a puppy because you're kind of some sick, twisted person and you enjoy inflicting pain on small, defenseless animals, then we could say that was a pretty messed up, bad thing to do. And then you might lose a lot of friends over that, or you should anyways. But I think the intent of an action is important to consider as it relates to the second criterion of obligatory inaction that I developed. But I think it is important to consider fraud as someone obstructing the property rights of another person. While they're not initiating violence or the threat of violence, they're lying, they're deceiving, they're misleading in the pursuit of fooling you into transferring over your property rights to them, where you would not have done that otherwise. You would not have made the decision to give them, I don't know, $50. You wouldn't have made the decision to have sex with them if they had been honest, forthright, and made it all clear to you. So I think fraud is definitely something that needs to be discussed, needs to be somehow included in the understanding of the NAP. Whether we go back and explicitly revise the NAP or we add this to our implicit understanding of what is being described. So we'll move on to number 5. This is getting kind of long, isn't it? Yep, yes it is. 5, parasitic on a theory of property. Even if the NAP is correct, it cannot serve as a fundamental principle of libertarian ethics because its meaning and normative force are entirely parasitic on an underlying theory of property. Suppose A is walking across an empty field when B jumps out of the bushes and clubs A on the head. Certainly looks like B is aggressing against A in this case. Okay, so this is the okay. Well, if someone sneezes at me, I get to shoot them in the head, right? Because pathogens are dangerous. And it's like, well, no, because that's a little. Anyways, well, this goes. This is a tired argument. You can tell this article was written 5 years ago at certain points, but back to my moral theory of obligatory inaction. I added a third criterion, which says an action is morally wrong if it exerts greater than the minimum required force to provide adequate defense. So this is really subjective, admittedly. I'll be the first to point this out. What is the minimum required force? Like, who's in charge of defining that? Okay, so let's just look at the example being offered by the author, Matt. So we've got a guy walking through a field, and the guy who owns the field jumps out and clubs him in the head. Let's just say he kills him. Let's say that the guy who owns the field kills the guy who's trespassing. Well, the way it's presented here, there was no dialogue, there was no warning. The guy was just walking through a field, presumably unmarked, is the way that it was presented. There were no signs in the scenario. So you would look at this and your gut reaction would be, that's kind of overkill. Like, did the guy even know he was trespassing? What was going on? There's no context here, really. It's kind of a bad example. But to just jump out and murder someone for being on your property without any dialogue, without any warning, we could say that's an over-escalation. You went too far. So if we're trying to define this concept of minimum required force to provide adequate defense, we would say that if someone is on your property and you don't want them to be, you start at the bottom, the absolute minimum, and then you work your way up. It's just like it's really just like the police do. Let's say you don't pay your taxes, so the first thing that they do is they send a letter, right? And we would say in the private sector, if someone didn't pay their bill to you, this would be a great place to start. There's no way you're crossing any lines here. Taxation is theft, but I'm just using it as an example. So the first thing that they do is they send you a letter, and then they say, hey, you didn't pay your taxes, pay up, or we'll be issuing a court summons. And then you don't pay, and then what do you know, they issue a court summons. Then you don't show up to court, and then what do you know, a police officer shows up at your house, and he tries to arrest you, and you resist, and what do you know, he tackles you to the ground. But you're still not going in without a fight, so you roll over and you punch the police officer in the face, and you run away, and what do you know, you get a bullet. you catch a bullet. Because there, with the state especially, there's this escalation of violence until you comply. And I think when you're defending your private property, this is perfectly adequate. You are allowed to start at the minimum, which would be dialogue, unless there's an existing history and you've established that whoever's on your property is actually there to like kill you or something, and they've made death threats or whatever. But if you don't know the person and you've never seen them before and they're just kind of like wandering around on your property, then you start with dialogue. You say, hey, you're on my property and I don't want you to be here. Leave, please. And then if they don't leave, then you threaten them and you say, leave or I'm going to make you leave. And then if they continue to stay, then you go actually follow through with your threat. Because it's your property, you've informed them that they're not allowed to be there, you've threatened them, and they're not listening, so then you actually resort to physical violence. And then at that point, if they still don't leave, then I guess you've threatened them, you made it very clear that you don't want them to be there. You could escalate it all the way until you kill them. Because at that point, like, what the hell are they doing there? If you've made it that clear and you're like physically attacking them, but they won't leave, at that point, I think you can escalate it all the way. Especially if they're fighting back. If like they're on your property and you threaten them and they won't leave, and then you attack them and they start fighting you back. Like what is that about? They're on your property and they're fighting you. Then you've got to do what it takes to keep yourself safe and defend your property. So you can escalate at that point. So I think this idea of minimum required force required for adequate defense, it's you started at the bottom, and now we here. You start at the minimum required, and you work your way up until they comply, or you have to kill them. It's what the state does. It's how laws are enforced. I think it's perfectly reasonable, as long as it's a private property owner defending their property. So that addresses that. Well, I guess I need to relate it back to the NAP. So the NAP doesn't address this because the NAP is really simple. The NAP is like one sentence long. It is just a general guiding principle for like 99% of things. But while it implies you're entitled to self-defense, it doesn't actually explicitly say just how much self-defense you're entitled to at any given time, because that's not what it's trying to do. Most people, and this is why the NAP has been so successful, is because it assumes a lot about human nature correctly. So 99% of the time, people resolve their conflicts somewhat peacefully, or as peacefully as they can. They use the minimum required force to provide adequate defense. But then sometimes you've got the person who's going to jump out of the bushes and club the trespasser in the head and kill them without ever speaking to them, without ever asking them why they were there or what they were doing. So because of that 1%, admittedly, the NAP does fall a little short. But, it does a great job of covering most things. So this whole thing about abandoning the NAP, I think it's a load of nonsense. We shouldn't abandon the NAP. We should teach it, and I've got a whole spiel on this. I know this video is getting really long now, but I'll give it to you at the end. So I'll just go ahead and move on to the sixth point before giving my spiel on the NAP as a tool. So, what about the children? So it's one thing to say that aggression against others is wrong. It's quite another to say that it's the only thing that's wrong, or the only wrong that is properly subject to prevention or rectification by force. Okay, so then he talks about, so everyone's heard this example. So you have a kid, and you don't feed the kid, so you're starving them to death, but you're not using violence or the threat of violence to prevent them from attaining food. And your common sense tells you that, yeah, starving your kids is wrong, but at first glance, the NAP doesn't really apply to this, or it doesn't address this. And in fact, it would say that it's permissible, right? Because you're not actually using violence. You're just, because you have no moral obligation to do anything, is one of the consequences of the NAP, as is argued by some people. you have no moral obligations to do anything, including, as the author of this article is arguing, including feed your children. But I think this is a fundamental error in the application of the NAP. The NAP only applies to interactions between adults, not children, because children are different from adults. I know there's this whole branch of libertarianism that wants to treat children like adults and grant them all the same rights as adults, but it just doesn't work like that. Children are incapable of providing for themselves. They're incapable of surviving on their own. They don't know enough about the world. They're not big enough. They're not strong enough. They're not smart enough. They are dependent. They're very dependent on adults, namely their parents, to provide for them. So when and in fact, I wrote quite a bit about the moral theory of obligatory inaction whenever I was working on it, and I do address this point. So if we take the idea of self-ownership, the self-ownership of people, when two parents decide to have a kid, the kid is the consequence of their actions, and while the kid can't be owned by anyone but themselves, his or herself, they are still dependent on the parents, and their existence, the kid's existence, is a direct consequence of the actions of the parents. So because the kid is dependent and also only there because the parents decided to have a kid, then it's the parents' responsibility. That is a moral obligation. The parents have a moral obligation to care for the child, or see to it that the child ends up in the hands of other people who can adequately care for the child. And this is, I believe, one of, if not the only, moral obligation that actually exists, is the moral obligation of a parent to care for the child. Because the child is not an adult. It is dependent. It's not able to care for itself. Very good chance it would die if not cared for by someone. Doesn't necessarily have to be the parents. Probably best case scenario is it would be the parents, but all that aside, you can't apply the NAP to any other type of interaction other than adult to adult interactions, not adult to children interactions. With that said, violence from an adult to a child is still a violation of the NAP as it's written. So it's not that it's totally inapplicable. It's that there are definite moral obligations from a parent to a child that aren't included in the NAP, because the NAP pretty much explicitly assumes that there are no moral obligations. So it's kind of another layer. It's like the NAP works pretty well for like 99% of all interactions between adults, but when you bring children into the picture, you have to consider that they are dependent. They need things to survive. They only exist because their parents made the decision to bring them into the world, or acted in a way that would cause them to be brought into the world. So they are the responsibility of the parents, and that's something that needs to be considered. It's not really the job of the NAP to address that kind of relationship, because, like I said, the NAP is really only for adults. But in my previous work, Moral Theory of Obligatory Inaction, I do think addresses that fairly well. Though there are some questions there I need to go back and revisit regarding, like, if a child can be owned by the parents, and like what gives the parents the right to care for the child. I think what I just said in this video is more accurate. It's more conducive with the rest of the theory. So maybe I'll go and revise that work and bring it back and make a full video on it at some point. But yeah, so these were the 6 reasons brought forth by Matt Zwolinski for libertarianism.org. And I feel like I've done a pretty good job of thoroughly going through their implications and how the NAP is lacking in some places, but it's not really, it's not a end-all be-all, right? It's not meant to be applied in this way, which is a nice segue to another main point that I wanted to make in this video, which is that the non-aggression principle is really a great tool for popularization, meaning it's taking the concept of strong property rights, of self-ownership, of personal liberty, of leaving others the hell alone, and letting them live their own lives in accordance to their own free will. It's taking all of these pretty complex ideas and boiling it down into really layman's terms, one sentence, and putting it out there. It's like the golden rule. It's like an evolution of the golden rule that is easily digestible, easy to remember, consumable by the masses. Even like low IQ, low comprehension people in society can still hear the NAP, understand what it means, and then use it to evaluate the moral value of the actions that they and others take. So with this respect, well, think of Christianity, right? Well, think of any religion in the world. The reason religion has been so important in this kind of in the pre-atheist age. I know we're closely approaching the fall of religion, which is kind of scary in some ways, but religion was used almost as a tool to spread virtue, moral values, moral philosophy, and it was an easily digestible way, though a lot of it tended to rest on the because God says so argument rather than, actually like reasoning through things and thinking from first principles out to actually being able to make a moral evaluation of actions. It was still a very valuable tool in that the wisdom of the elders, right? The wisdom of all these old people who had lived their lives, learned a lot of things from their lives, witnessed the lives of other people, seen how people's actions affected them throughout their lives, and they've learned a lot. They know a lot about what you need to do to live a good life, how to have, how to achieve happiness, how to make sound business decisions, how to treat other people, all this kind of stuff. Just a wealth of knowledge accumulated by old people just through living. And, rather than preach and preach and preach and scold and yell at young people and try to save them from making the same mistakes they made in their life, which very rarely works, instead you have religion, and you have the threat of hell, and you have the promise of eternal salvation in a paradise. And rather than going to the trouble of saying, this is bad because... I can come up with an actual example. Let's see. Honor thy father and thy mother is an example that I can use. So the reason it's important to respect your parents is because a lot of times they might know a little bit more about the world than you do because they've been around a little bit longer, and respecting their wishes might save you from a lot of headache. Like I just said, making the same mistakes they made, making the mistakes that they've already made and learned from. You don't need to waste your time making those mistakes if you would kind of heed their warning, respect their word. But rather than taking the time to really explain that, you can boil it down to one of the 10 commandments and say, God says do this, so do it, or go to hell kind of thing. So with that respect, having an easily digestible, kind of not a lot of thought to it, just something that here God says do this, and then you should do it because God says so, kind of thing. That's really easy to understand. It's not great for the whole start at a fundamental axiom of truth and then reason out to your moral code based on reason and evidence. It's not great for all that. It doesn't really promote a lot of critical thought, but it does get people to make better decisions, by and large, better decisions. It does get people to behave as if they've acquired the wisdom of, like thousands of years of people making mistakes and learning from them. When in reality, they're just following this simple set of rules that they've been told to follow. And the NAP, the non-aggression principle, is really similar to this because it's a really easily digestible thing, simple to follow, consumable, contains a lot of wisdom about what things are wrong, how to identify them as wrong. It deals with the idea of consent, of property rights, a lot of complicated ideas that would be difficult to sit down and explain and make an hour-long video to go through and nitpick everything. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with adult interactions, it does cover like 99% of things. It has to assume a few things about human nature, which I think it does pretty well. But in general, it's a really good tool for describing what's wrong, what to avoid, and how to identify evil in the world, which are really complicated. But your average person can understand the NAP. So I don't think we need to abandon or reject the NAP. I think it does need to be strengthened. I think, or at least make a ton of discussion and debate and ideas and interpretations of the non-aggression principle widely available to as many people who want to read up on it as possible, but use the NAP as this kind of starter. It's like level 1. It's like you walk into Chemistry 101 and they tell you, I don't know, I hate chemistry, but they tell you something that applies generally, like the structure of electrons on a molecule, or the structure of electrons on an atom. Sorry, excuse me. And it turns out that in every case, or it turns out that electrons don't actually behave like that in every case, right? There are exceptions, right? But the base information applies to like 99% of the time. So then in higher levels of chemistry classes, you go and you look at the edge cases. You go and look at the application as it deals with rarer instances or stuff like that. I think I'm beating this to death, but I think it's important to realize what the NAP is, and it's not an end-all be-all moral theory. It just barely describes actions which are wrong, which should never be done. And if you see an issue with it, congratulations, welcome to Chemistry 201. It's like you can level up now. But so I think those are some good things to think about moving forward regarding the non-aggression principle. And this is definitely a conversation that needs to continue happening, but abandoning the NAP is definitely not the way to go. Strengthening it would be a much better course of action as we move into the future and more people are exposed to it. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.